In my RTX 5070 VR performance video I put out a few weeks ago, toward the end of that video I noted the 5070 was 21% faster than its predecessor, the 4070 Super, in the Unigine Superposition VR benchmark. One of my viewers commented on that video saying it was nice to see the 5070 was faster than the 4070 Super in VR because all the flat gaming benchmarks say the 5070 and the 4070 Super perform more or less exactly the same. This comment made me worry a little bit that some of you watching these videos may think because the 5070 is faster in that one benchmark that it means it's faster in VR across the board, which for anyone who knows about PC hardware and video game benchmarking, just because one GPU is faster than another in one game or benchmark doesn't mean it's going to be faster in every application. At the same time, it also made me curious. I wanted to find out if the 5070's performance in Superposition was just one of those outlier situations, or if the 5070 actually does perform better in VR than the 4070 Super. I had one little problem though. About 8 months ago, I sold my 4070 Super. Luckily, I have a cousin who lives close by who actually owns the exact same model 4070 Super I used to perform that benchmark. The Gigabyte 4070 Super Gaming OC 12G. I reached out to him to see if I could borrow it, which he agreed to do, and I let him borrow the 5070 while I tested his 4070 Super. The first thing I did was run it through Superposition to see how his 4070 Super compared to the one I'd sold, and over the course of 7 benchmark runs, it averaged 44.83 FPS, where the one I had owned previously had averaged 44.65 FPS, so only a 0.18 FPS difference, which is what I was hoping to see. Prior to borrowing my cousin's 4070 Super, I ran the 5070 through the Superposition VR benchmark for a second time as well, and it averaged 53.89 FPS, which was within the margin of error when I compared it to the results from the first time I'd tested it. Doing the math on that real quick comes out to the 5070 being 20% faster than the 4070 Super. So 1% lower than the first time I compared the results, but still in the same ballpark. Now, like I said earlier, I wanted to find out if the performance we're seeing with the 5070 is isolated to just this benchmark, or if this extends out to VR gaming in general. So naturally, I needed to run some games, and the first one I took a look at was Life Alyx. For this test, I decided to play through the part of the game where you meet the Vortigaunt, as I feel it's one of the coolest parts of the game, as well as one of the more visually impressive moments in the game. Now, for comparing the 4070 Super and the RTX 5070, I'm using Virtual Desktop with a Quest 3. The render resolution set to godlike, the refresh rate to 120 Hz, and for Life Alyx, I'm using its Ultra Fidelity performance option. For performance monitoring, I'm using FPS VR, and while it does give us the average frame rate for our gaming session, in some of the games in this video, it's not as accurate as others. I tried to only enable FPS VR after I'd loaded into a game to get the most accurate numbers possible, but there were some games where my test system was getting hit so hard with the render resolution set this high, I couldn't launch FPS VR while the game was running and had to start it before, which led to some games showing a higher average frame rate, because when you first load in and you're in the menus, you get a much higher frame rate than what you actually get once a game instance is running. Life Alyx is not one of those games, however, so we can trust the average FPS in this one. But on the games where this is not the case, I'll let you know. Okay, as you can see here, by the end of my run-through of this part of the game, the 5070 is averaging almost 20 FPS more than the 4070 Super, which calculates out to a 19% performance increase over the 4070 Super. So very close to the 20% we saw in Superposition. While this result is interesting, we obviously still need to look at more games. So the next game I took a look at was what I feel is one of the most demanding games there is to run in VR, Microsoft Flight Simulator. Since we're running Flight Simulator at such a high resolution, I've set the graphic settings in the game to their lowest levels in order to get a frame rate that doesn't resemble a slideshow. And as you can see in this training flight, the 4070 Super and the 5070 were within 2 or 3 FPS of one another. The 5070 was the better performer, but not by enough to make any kind of appreciable difference. If you take a look at the average frame rate of the 5070 in this video, you'll notice it's sitting a little higher than the current frame rate, and that's because I started up FPS VR while in the game menu instead of waiting until after starting the flight. I would have just retested this, but by the time I noticed this, I'd already loaned the 5070 to my cousin, and I didn't want to wait several more days to release this video. As you can see here though, the frame rate is very consistent throughout my test, so it's pretty easy to see for yourself that the average frame rate of the 5070 was somewhere in the neighborhood of 37 FPS, and the average for the 4070 Super was around 35. And when you do the math on that, you get a difference of 5.7%. Of course, if we were trying to get a good playable frame rate in this game, we'd turn the render resolution down, but to keep things simple for this comparison video, I just decided to run all the games at Virtual Desktop's maximum resolution. The next game I fired up was one I've never tested in any other video before, and actually haven't even really played it. But it's one some of you guys have been asking for, and that is Bootstrap Island. Because of the sandbox nature of this game, getting an apples-to-apples comparison isn't an easy thing to do, as different things can happen each time you play it. So I decided to use the tutorial at the beginning of the game as my benchmark, as the same things happen every time you play through it. I did my best to replicate the run I made using the 5070 with the 4070 Super, and this is the performance I got. Yes, I did make the same mistake while testing the 5070 in this one I did with Flight Simulator, where I've started up FPS VR while still in the game's start menu, so our average FPS is reading a little higher than what the actual game performance was. And again, by the time I realized this, my cousin had the 5070 in his possession, and I wanted to get this video finished sooner rather than later, so I've made the decision on this comparison to just observe the side-by-side difference, and rather than give an exact percentage increase, I encourage you to pause the video at any given moment during this segment, and you'll see the 5070 was performing between 8 and 10 FPS higher than the 4070 Super using the settings listed on screen. A game I did not make the mistake of starting FPS VR at the wrong time on was Assetto Corsa. And for this one, I always use the game's built-in benchmark because that way you're testing the exact same scenario every single time. As we approach the end of the benchmark run, you can see the 4070 Super is averaging 63 FPS, and the 5070 76.5 FPS, which is a 21% uplift in performance over the 4070 Super. Another game I used an on-rails benchmark for is VR Chat. In the comments of my 5070 video, a viewer suggested I check out a world in VR Chat called VRC Mark, which is exactly what it sounds like, a benchmark world for VR Chat. It has several different world scenarios you can test with, each one with varying degrees of effects and whatnot to see how your system handles them. I ran through the 4 different worlds you can test in, but for this video, I'm just showing the one that's the most difficult to run. Now, VR Chat is one of the games that I was not able to start FPS VR once the benchmark was running. If I tried to do that, my system would just lock up, so I had to start it before beginning the benchmark, which gave us average frame rate numbers much higher than what the actual performance during the benchmark was. So, like Bootstrap Island, I encourage you to pause the video at any given moment to see what the frame rate difference is. As I reviewed the footage, I typically saw a difference of 8 or 9 FPS, and in terms of percentage difference, with the 4070 Super only being in the low to mid 20s and the 5070 being in the low to mid 30s, 8 to 9 FPS is actually more than a 30% uplift, which is pretty significant. The 4070 Super and the 5070 performed within 1 FPS of one another in forefront. Both GPUs are plenty powerful enough to run this game at 120 Hz. As you can see, the GPU usage percentage for both was typically in the 70s and 80s. But even though the GPUs were far from being maxed out, we weren't exactly getting a smooth, consistent frame rate, as I took this ATV on a lap around the training area map. With nothing on the FPS VR performance overlay giving us any clues as to why this was happening, I enabled Virtual Desktop's performance overlay, and right away saw our latency metric was not good. The game latency, meaning the time it was taking the GPU to render frames, was fine, but it was the encode and more so the network latency that was the problem. So this was more of a wireless streaming bottleneck than a GPU processing one. But yeah, this test was more or less a tie. Neither GPU outperformed the other, really. Into the Radius 2 is another game where I had to start FPS VR before actually loading into the game, so the average frame rate counter isn't as accurate as it may seem. Yeah, it looks like it's pretty accurate, but while loading into a game, the frame rate drops way down, affecting that average number a lot. So once again, this is one where we need to pause the video from time to time and manually compare the frame rate. During the times the game was running somewhat smoothly, the frame rate was 7 or 8 FPS higher on the 5070. However, there was this moment as I approached this car where the frame rate really crapped out on both GPUs. I'm assuming the game was loading the next area ahead of the car or something at this time. But while both GPUs struggled in this instance, the 5070 did handle this spot better than the 4070 Super. And again, on average, the frame rate was higher on the 5070. So once again, it outperformed the 4070 Super by a decent margin. The last game I tested both graphics cards in was No Man's Sky. This is a game I've never played before, let alone benchmarked in a video. But people have been asking for this one for a long time, so I literally just started up a new game, and the very first place the game put me, I walked around the area in a circle, and that became my test loop. So if this is a poor way of doing this, which it very well could be, please let me know. Like Into the Radius 2, my PC would lock up when I tried to enable FPS VR after having loaded into a game instance. So this is another one where you're going to get the best idea of how the 4070 Super and 5070 compare by pausing the video from time to time and looking at the current frame rate. At the beginning of my loop, the 5070 was leading the 4070 Super by 10 to 12 FPS, but there was also a point about halfway through where both GPUs dropped to 45 FPS. But pretty quickly after that, the 5070 regained its lead of roughly 10 frames per second, which lasted through the end of my loop. So now for the TLDR part of the video, or I guess since it's a video and not a written article, the TLDW. Too long didn't watch. Based off the 8 games I looked at here, the RTX 5070 definitely performs better in VR than the 4070 Super. Now, what exactly is the reason for this? I'm not 100% sure, but based on my current understanding of how GPUs work, I believe it's the 5070's GDDR7 that's giving it the edge. In normal flat gaming benchmarks, we see little to no difference between the 4070 Super and the 5070 because most all flat gaming benchmarks are conducted at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K, where the increased speed of the GDDR7 doesn't really make much of a difference. Well, let me walk that statement back just a little bit. At 4K, we do start to see this come into play, but as we increase the resolution further in VR, the difference really begins to stand out. In the tests I did for this video, we were running at more than double the resolution of 4K. All that texture detail and other graphics data has to be stored in the GPU's VRAM before the GPU can do the calculations it needs to do in order to run a game. So the higher a GPU's memory bandwidth is, the more quickly that data comes available for the GPU to process, and in this case, the 5070 having GDDR7 on board, which is significantly faster than the GDDR6X on the 4070 Super, gives it a nice performance uplift over its predecessor. Now, if you currently own a 4070 Super, would I recommend upgrading to the 5070 to play VR games? No, I would not. But if you're in the market for a new GPU or a new PC and are wanting to do some PC VR gaming, then I would definitely recommend at least considering GPUs with GDDR7, assuming they fit into your budget, of course, over those using older types of graphics memory, because ultimately GDDR7 is going to deliver a better VR experience. Come on, do it. You know you want to. Subscribe!